News Network, everybody. We've been planning a little bit of a special segment here on a number of topics this afternoon. Our first guest is ready to join us. Mychal Wilson is a trial attorney and a federal appeals attorney. Welcome to Law News, Mychal.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, one of the issues I wanted to talk about is this issue of executive pardons, because here's what's been going on in the grand scheme of things. We want to look at this from a legal angle, not a political angle. But in a speech this week, President Trump said that more or less he was considering, and I'm paraphrasing, but he was considering a pardon for Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who's a former sheriff in Maricopa County, Arizona. He's been known and oftentimes called the toughest sheriff in America. And here's the bottom line. This sheriff got in trouble with the court because he was rounding up members of the Latino community, oftentimes through traffic stops.
Right.
The accusation was that it was merely because of their race. He was detaining them without charges and then trying to check to see if they were not in the country legally. In other words, illegal immigrants, undocumented persons, whatever you want to call it. And if I call it one way, the other side of the political community will lambaste me for not calling it what they want to call the issue. But the bottom line is the court said no enforcement ability here. Sheriff, you can't be enforcing federal immigration law, and said there's Fourth Amendment implications here as well as to unreasonable searches and seizures. So let's unpack the original decision here against the sheriff. Sounds legally sound to me. I mean, we've got a Fourth Amendment. It says that people are secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. Okay, it specifically says what that amendment protects, and the courts tend to interpret it relatively broadly. You know, and as to the issue as to whether a local sheriff can enforce federal immigration law, well, that has to do with, well, it's federal law. If the federal government says that it wants to be the enforcer of it, then they get to snatch it away from local officials.
Correct.
So the bottom line is that the sheriff got in trouble with the court on that, and you know, now the president's saying that he's considering more or less some kind of a pardon here. How does the pardon mechanism work?
Well, President Trump does have the authority to pardon, as any president would. And essentially, it's essentially like an executive order, so he can do it. The issue here, though, it goes a little deeper in that Arpaio actually was profiling vehicles, and there was no violations of the vehicle. So had he, say, pulled over people who had, say, a busted tail light or something like that, then there would be cause to actually arrest them and ship them back out the country. But he didn't do that. He profiled Latinos coming over the border or within the state of Arizona. And so that's the issue right there. And he violated court orders several times. So he even stated that basically he was above the law.
So what does it all mean as far as a presidential pardon? I mean, how does that procedure work? Usually the person who has faced some kind of federal trouble has to petition for it. That's my understanding. So why is it that we're hearing through the news that the White House is saying that they're going to begin, quote, like drafting up the papers?
Right. So basically, when Arpaio, whenever he, whatever the sentence is going to come down on him by the court, at that time, I'm sure he's already has his petition ready. So once that comes down, he's going to petition immediately to the White House, to President Trump. President Trump is going to have his orders already in place, and he will be pardoned. So, or supposedly pardoned. So, you know, that's the issue here. Now, one other issue here, you know, President Trump was just in Arizona, and the new sheriff stated recently that the community thought Arpaio basically was wrong. They want to move in a new direction, and they thought that the actual profiling was wrong and illegal.
What does it ultimately mean as far as limits on executive power? Because one of the other sides of this debate is, well, this is a pretty freewheeling power that a president has. It was part of the original Constitution. But is there ultimately a check on the president's authority if the president can just sort of go and pardon whoever he likes? What does this ultimately mean as far as justice for people who were being unfairly targeted by this sheriff? Does it, in essence, mean that any sheriff who wants to go and round any single one of us up on the streets for whatever reason, you know, because I've got gray hair, because somebody else is a member of a specific race, does that mean any of us can get rounded up in violation of the Fourth Amendment because the president's going to just pardon the person once they get in trouble?
Yes, and I think President Trump here, that's a great point. I think he will be setting a legal precedent here, because that, I think, was worrying a lot of the civil rights groups in terms of his ability just to pardon people. And more importantly, for local law enforcement to disregard the law, to become, you know, above the law. So basically, Sheriff Arpaio, who was a local police officer, is basically trumping federal law right now. That's the more important issue.
So where does it ultimately end then? I mean, does this mean that this presidential pardon can neuter the Fourth Amendment?
Essentially, and you know what? Trump again has kind of President Trump has kind of again put himself in a corner here where he's going to have to act. And let's see if it's all talk or if he's going to have, you know, actually pardon Sheriff Arpaio. I mean,
there's another little issue here that's sort of swimming around on the side, and I think that people who had to read the Prince case in law school see the inverse happening here. That's a case from 1997 where a sheriff sued and said, wait a minute, I don't want to be forced to enforce parts of the Brady bill. That's the handgun legislation that came out of the shooting of Press Secretary Brady when he was with President Reagan. And there you had a local sheriff saying, I don't want anything to do with this federal stuff, and the federal government can't force me to take care of what ought to be a federal issue. Okay, you know, the decision came down on the side of the 10th Amendment, federalism, states' rights. You know, if he's a sworn state official, he can't be forced to do the federal government's job. And I just think that legally it's interesting that this is sort of the exact opposite of that.
Right, but the difference between the 10th and the 4th, I mean, we're talking about the Fourth Amendment, which has been very well tested over the years regarding search and seizures. And here, Sheriff Arpaio, what he was doing was violating the law, and he put himself above the law. And you know, maybe he could have worked differently within the system. You know, he even found a broken taillight on some of the cars, or you know, something that
nobody's contesting that issue at all. You know, look, a police officer has grounds to pull somebody over if they're speeding, crossing the line, broken taillight, any violation of the motor vehicle and traffic law in whatever the jurisdiction, that person can be pulled over. And as we know from criminal law, that's oftentimes how other evidence is discovered. It starts with a broken tail light or a license plate that's covered in mud or something, and then whoops, all of a sudden there's a pile of pills in the back seat that don't belong there. Nobody has a prescription for them. Whose are they? Well, the Gantt case says you can you know, charge the person with possession if they're within arm's reach. You know, that's how the whole thing plays out. But there are a lot of cases where, you know, the courts have been really clear on the Fourth Amendment. You can't just randomly pull somebody over because, oh, they look like they might have been drunk, or they look like a pothead. You know, you can't do that unless there's a violation of the vehicle and the traffic law to, you know, give rise to reasonable suspicion.
Right, and another thing too that hurts Trump's pardon and Sheriff Arpaio is Arpaio, he has been consistently taunting and flouting his own reason to do it. I mean, basically saying he was above the law. There's, you know what, I'm going to do it. I don't want these people in this country, and I have the right to pull him over.
Well, you know, what's the counter narrative here for people who say, look, we need, as a political position, for there to be tougher immigration enforcement? It would seem to me that the response should properly be, under the law, that there is a right way and a wrong way to go about that. And the issue isn't so much the political debate over whether we need tougher immigration enforcement, because if people agree that there should be tougher legal immigration enforcement, then there's a right way to do it, and this was not the right way.
Correct. And there's other ways, I mean, through legislation that could have been done. There's other ways the sheriff could have done it himself. I mean, let's say like Friday and Saturday nights, he could have had checkpoints for DUI checkpoints, which could have justified pulling, Latinos over and charging them and arresting them. But he didn't do that. It was just, he was essentially profiling. So had he worked in the system, he could have found a way to achieve his goal, but he didn't do that. And part of the issue here, again, is him just taunting and said, I'm not going to follow the law, basically. He said, I'm not going to follow the Fourth Amendment, which as you, me, whoever, I mean, that's the Constitution that we all live by.
Yeah, okay, so if he says he's not going to follow the Fourth Amendment, then why did they charge him federally? Can't the state get him for not going and upholding his oath of office, which he would have ultimately given to state officials?
I think they could have, but again, the Fourth Amendment is when you're talking about the federal, is the federal portion of it.
Yeah, so that's why he wound up in federal court, and that's how the president can pardon him. Now, we know this from plenty of other cases, but it's worth repeating. Legally, a president can't pardon someone who's been charged and convicted of a state crime. There's a clear limit in the Constitution that the president shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. A president can't pardon himself from impeachment. They did deal with that logic. You can't make it that circular. But it's been interpreted that there cannot be a pardon on a state offense, only a federal one.
Okay, and so what happens right there is, I don't know the background, it's something to explore in terms of why didn't the state charge the sheriff? Why, was it a political reason? Because we are talking about Arizona. And so we are talking about the immigration issue, and why didn't the state proceed? So that I don't have the answer to, and that's a very good question.
Yeah, it raises plenty of interesting fodder. Now, what kind of offenses can a president pardon? Is it wide open? The president could pardon any federal offense, or other than, of course, the impeachment, or is there some kind of limit on it?
Well, basically, you're dealing with federal issues, so you're talking about felonies. And that falls under that umbrella right there. And so what you've seen, for example, drug convictions, hey, Don King, remember the boxing promoter? I mean, he was eventually pardoned, I think, for a manslaughter charge. So, there's various crimes that the president can pardon.
Let's switch gears just very briefly here and talk a little bit about the First Amendment, because we were hoping to talk a little bit more about this, but we do have another segment planned for about 5 minutes from now. But you were giving me some interesting context on the parameters of free speech and the First Amendment. And the reason we've been getting into this issue a little bit here at LawNewz is because, of course, of the protests and the counter-protests in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I've been refreshing myself on all my First Amendment jurisprudence, and there are all of these different exceptions where the courts won't protect speech. And one of the issues up for debate is in whether or not so-called hate speech should be added to that definition somehow. Courts usually don't protect obscenity, fighting words. Defamation can result in a libel and slander award of money damages. Courts do not consider the First Amendment to be a shield against child pornography. Perjury is not protected. Blackmail is not protected. Incitement to riot is not protected. We've got all these different things. Copyright plagiarism is not protected by the First Amendment. It can't be, because the copyright clause is in another area of the Constitution. Right. So, we've got all these things, and there's been this debate recently about whether or not hate speech should be added. But it gets us into the old conundrum where it turns into circular logic. Okay, well, who gets to decide what hate speech is, and do we want anyone to have that power? Right.
Anytime with hate speech, obviously that is an exception to the First Amendment. And we saw that in Charlottesville. And what I find very interesting, why it should not be protected, is exactly why you saw what happened in Charlottesville. And another reason, if you go back historically, listen, in 1978-79 in Greensboro, there was the issue of, I think it was United Workers Union, who were going after protecting blacks. And they marched in Greensboro and said, "Death to the Klan, death to the Klan." Well, the Klan came out during their rally and shot several of these protesters. Later on, the Klan was found not guilty via self-defense. So, when it goes both sides, and I think, a lot of people, the way Trump presented his argument during Charlottesville wasn't effective, but I understood the reasoning because in these protests, whether it's Charlottesville, whether it's Missouri, you do have hate speech on both sides, and the protesters clash. And that's one thing that should not be allowed.
Well, one idea has been kicked around recently, Mychal, and I know I've got to let you go in a minute, but one idea that's been kicked around is, okay, well, who do we want to give enforcement power to in order to enforce what is or is not hate speech? Could you imagine Jeff Sessions, Donald Trump, being the arbiters of what is or is not hate speech? Because, okay, you add hate speech to the list of speech that does not enjoy First Amendment protection. Well, which side of those protests in Charlottesville could you picture being prosecuted if we give this administration the power to decide what is or is not hate speech?
Right, and that's why the branches are divided, and the hate speech is determined by the courts, not by the executive branch, and it should stay that way.
This is a topic that I would love to continue to debate, but we're going to switch gears and bring on another guest here in a couple of minutes. Mychal Wilson, a trial attorney and federal appeals attorney. Nice to have you here on Law News. We'll talk again sometime soon.
Thank you.
We're going to switch